Okay, everybody, this is my video tutorial on microevolution. My name is Elliot Kimmel, and at some point in time in your usually grade 11 biology course, you are going to come across this topic of microevolution. Chances are you will have talked already about Charles Darwin and natural selection. You may have already talked about speciation, and I'll be throwing in a little bit of all of that as we go through this. Please, if you haven't already, check out my website, www.zerobio.com, for more video tutorials and flash animations, games, and quizzes, and worksheets and stuff like that. All right, so here we go, microevolution. We are going to be talking about what microevolution actually is. So we'll be defining the term, looking at various examples, and then looking at how does microevolution happen. There are four main things or factors that go into creating microevolution. The first one is mutation. We're talking about genetic mutation, and we'll have a look at that. Genetic drift, we'll be looking at two main types of genetic drift, the founder effect and bottleneck. We'll be looking at gene flow, and in particular the actual absence or reduction of gene flow, and then natural selection, and three types of natural selection: stabilizing, directional, and disruptive selection. Okay, so here we go. We're talking about microevolution. So what is microevolution? Well, we can define it as small-scale changes in gene or allele frequencies. Now, when we say small-scale changes, we are talking about changes within a population of organisms or even within a species of organisms that are relatively minor. We are not talking about fish evolving into dogs or dinosaurs. We are talking about changes in a particular species or population of fish or dogs. All right, so within a group of organisms or within a species, small changes in maybe fur thickness or eye color or beak length in birds, but not going from birds to lizards, that kind of thing. Now, obviously, in order to talk about evolution, we have to talk about genetics. And I don't know how much genetics you've done, but we'll touch on that here. We are talking about genes, and genes are the parts of genetic material or DNA. And let's just focus on DNA and not any of the other nucleic acids. But genes are the parts of DNA that code for certain traits. You know that within your cells you have genetic material, DNA, that causes you to have brown or blue eyes, blood type A, your pigmentation, your hair color, and all of those traits are caused by genes. Now, I happen to have blue eyes and you might have brown eyes. We both have eyes and have eye color, so we both have the genes for eye color. My gene makes blue, your gene makes brown. Because they are both eye color genes, but they differ, they're called genes. They're still genes, but because they're different, they're called alleles. So an example is, think about Coke, Coca-Cola, the soft drink, all right? There is Diet Coke, regular Coke, caffeine-free Coke, cherry Coke. They are all types of Coke, but they are varieties of Coke. They are like alleles. So I may have blood type A and you have blood type B. Again, these are traits. Blood type is a trait, but it's caused by genes, and the genes that give me type A blood versus your type B blood are very similar. They're both the blood type gene, but yours is B and mine is A, so those are called alleles. Now, graphically, I want to show you an image over here. I have drawn two chromosomes, and these are called homologous chromosomes. So imagine this chromosome came from the father, and that's the symbol for the male, and this chromosome came from the mother. In sexual reproduction, a sperm and egg unite, and the sperm carries some chromosomes, genetic material, the egg carries some chromosomes, and the offspring is a mix of all of those chromosomes inherited from the father and from the mother. In humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so that the sperm donates 23 chromosomes and the egg donates 23 chromosomes for a total of 46. But because your father has eyes and your mother has eyes, you end up with 2 chromosomes with information about eyes or eye color, let's say. Or in this example, on this chromosome represented by this sort of bluish cylinder, I've highlighted these letters. And letters are often used to indicate genes that code for a particular trait. So on this chromosome, let's call this chromosome number 1 from the father. Well, mother also has chromosome number 1, and in her egg, she donates one of those chromosome number 1s. Your father donates one of the chromosome number 1s in the sperm, so that you end up having 2 chromosome 1s and 2 chromosome 2s. So 2 1s, 2 2s, 2 3s, all the way down to 2 chromosome number 23s. That's a total of 46 chromosomes. But on chromosome number 1 from the father, there is a big T drawn here. This could be the gene causing tallness. Now, I say this is a gene, but you just see a letter here. Well, that's the way that in genetics we represent genes coding for a particular trait. We just give it a letter and we say, this is really a stretch of DNA, and I don't know how much DNA you've covered, but don't worry about it right now. This DNA causes tallness in the offspring. And for your mother's chromosome number 1, at the same position on her chromosome 1 as on the father's chromosome 1, she also has a gene. But this gene causes not tallness, but shortness or dwarfness. Now, the capital versus small letter gets into Mendelian genetics, dominance and recessiveness. You may or may not have done that yet, but you will eventually. So, because both of these are genes that deal with height, let's say, but they differ in terms of one causes tall and one causes short, these are genes, and they're alternate genes, or they're variations of a gene, and they're called alleles. But on a particular chromosome, there's not just one gene, there's many, many genes. I've drawn just a second one here saying, let's say the father donates a gene causing little r, which generally in pea plants means wrinkled seeds, and a little r over here. Or this could be for tongue rolling. Let's say father donated the gene for inability to roll the tongue, and so did mother. Well, your outward expression of that would be determined by what genes you inherited from your parents. In this case, 2 little r's. Now, these are identical genes, so they're not really alleles of each other, but these two are alleles. So alleles just mean alternate forms of a gene. Blue eyes, brown eyes, blood type A, blood type B, tall or short. They're all dealing with the same trait, but they are alleles of each other. So microevolution deals with changes in the gene or allele frequencies within a population. Now, I'm going to explain that as we go further on, so let's do that. Examples of microevolutionary traits are things like changes in beak shape in birds or changes in eye color in populations. So let's look at an illustration of that. Imagine down here we've got a bird with a short, blunt beak. And over time, we get a long, pointed beak. This would be microevolution. We're not going from a bird with a short, blunt beak and switching over to, flat feet or something like that, all right? We're just looking at one particular sort of trait that's changing within that population of birds. This short, blunt beak might be really, really great for chewing small seeds or feeding on small flowers. But let's say over time the environment changed and the seeds changed or the plants changed so that a long pointed beak was more adaptive for those animals, then these ones would tend to survive and reproduce better. Now, we'll talk more about how you go from this one to this one, but that is an example of microevolution. We're not saying you are turning from a bird with a short, blunt beak into a dog with no beak at all. We are looking within a group of organisms, small changes. Now, we haven't yet seen a change in gene frequency, but of course, this beak or this beak would be caused by genes. Genes are the stretches of DNA that cause a trait. And so in order to have this trait, you have to have particular genes for it. So in other words, the blunt beak genes changed over time, and now the population has long pointed beak genes. So we'll have to talk about how that could happen, all right? Right now, we are looking at a small change in something called phenotype. Phenotype is the expression of your genes. So you have genes for tallness or tongue rolling or eye color or beak length, and the phenotype is what results from those genes. So short blunt beak is a phenotype. Long pointed beak is a phenotype. Your height, your eye color, your skin pigmentation, your blood type, these are called phenotypes, expressions of the genes. The genes themselves are called your genotype. The genes that you have that code for traits, the genes are called the genotype. The expression of those genes, what those genes cause, is called phenotype. So let's look at another example here. So we have a population over here, and you can see that 3 organisms have 1 blue eye each, all right? And 3 organisms have brown eyes, or 1 brown eye, all right? So there is a 3 blue to 3 brown ratio. The frequency of the blue eye gene is 3. The frequency of brown eyes is 3. But let's imagine over time that changed. Imagine that the blue-eyed people got together more often and had babies, so that over time blue eyes increased in the population and brown eyes somewhat decreased. They didn't reproduce as much. Now we have 6 blue eyes to 2 brown eyes. The gene frequency has changed. And that's what we're talking about here, a change in gene or allele frequency. And this is evolution. The population has evolved. We didn't go from this population with blue and brown eyes to all of a sudden having antennae and clawed hands or something like that. We're talking about a small change, just in eye color, but that is evolution. And it's caused by changes in gene frequency. As the blue-eyed organisms reproduced more, there were more blue-eyed babies born in the population. The population has evolved. Individuals don't evolve. You don't evolve and have 1 blue eye and then later on in your lifetime have 6 blue eyes and antenna and stuff like that. I mean, I suppose that could happen, but that's not how evolution works. This is microevolution, small-scale changes in particular traits that result from changes in the genes. How could the genes change, or how could we get new genes? In this case, we didn't get new genes, we just had the same genes in this gene pool, collection of genes. The organisms then reproduced, and we have now a new frequency or a new number of the same genes. We didn't create new ones. There happens to be more blue eyes. That's evolution, but we didn't create green eyes out of this. For that, we need mutation. Okay, so this is what microevolution is, and I'll have more examples as we move along through here. Okay, so how does it happen? How does microevolution happen? Well, the major driving force of evolution, microevolution, is mutation. Mutation is changes in the genetic material. Now, there is genetic material at multiple locations within a cell, but we're going to focus on the nucleus, and we're going to talk about DNA. So a mutation is a change in the genetic material. Now, over here, I have an illustration of a cell. and you can see the nucleus, and there is a piece of genetic material, and there, and we're going to call that DNA. And imagine if some kind of environmental phenomenon impacts that cell, that DNA, like ultraviolet radiation or X-rays or some toxin in the food could have an effect on the DNA that could cause a mutation, and therefore a new trait is formed because the DNA code has changed. Now, mutations may create new combinations of genetic material as this lightning bolt hits the DNA and jumbles it all up. It causes a change in that DNA, and we get new genes. Now, I'm going to show you an illustration of what I'm talking about down here. So, DNA is often drawn as a ladder-like structure. Now, this is not really a tutorial on the structure of DNA, but we have to talk a little bit about it. There are different parts to the DNA, but the important part is, if this is a ladder, the rungs, the steps of a ladder. So imagine this is a ladder sitting on its side, and all of these are the steps of a ladder, all right? Now, you're also going to notice that these steps have letters on them, A, T, C, and G. Now, when you study molecular biology and DNA, you'll get more into what that means. But this is really the code of DNA. So, and when I say that, I'm talking about one of these long stringy-like things has all of these letters in it. And if you were to read these letters, ACT, GCT, this is your genotype. And this group of letters, or it could be the bottom ones, is a code, right? ACT, GCT, it's a word, it's a code. This might cause blue eyes, all right? A mutation occurs due to whatever the phenomenon might be, and that changes the DNA. Notice I've circled this letter over here. It was a C, and it needed to be a C to create blue eyes. But now it's changed to an A. That stretch of DNA now has changed. It's now ACT-GAT. That might cause brown eyes. Now, I'm not trying to say that brown-eyed people have a genetic mutation. I'm just saying that if the DNA is mutated, the gene is changed, and that can cause a new outcome or a new phenotype. It might be that this gene coded for short beaks in birds, and this change caused long beaks in birds. So imagine an environmental change, radiation, or whatever it was, causing a change in DNA, and the offspring birds are born with longer beaks. It's just an accident. It happens. Now, will that be good for the bird or not good for the bird? Well, that's yet to be determined. Mutations may be harmful, and probably when you think about mutation, you generally think, you know, mutation sounds bad, all right? And often it is going to be a bad thing, all right? But it could be beneficial. You could get birds with longer beaks that are better able to survive. Or you could get a wolf with slightly thicker fur. It's better able to survive in the winter. It can also be neutral, and really to understand harmful, beneficial, or neutral mutations, you need to study grade 12 chemistry or grade 12 biology, the genetic strand, and that's where you're going to see more about this. For now, I just want you to understand that mutations can occur, changes in DNA, and that leads to new genes. And that's how we get changes and evolution in a population. Those mutations are then passed on to the offspring. And we are talking about mutations that are passed on through the gametes, through the sex cells, so that if you happen to have a mutation in your lifetime, I mean, if you had, God forbid, skin cancer, which causes genetic changes in your cells, that is not going to be passed on to your babies because it happened within your lifetime. Anyways, that gets into some other aspects of mutation we don't need to cover. Okay, so mutation is a form of producing new genetic material, new genes, new alleles, which is important for microevolution. Genetic drift. Changes in the genetic material due to chance events that do not necessarily favor the most fit. Now, this is important. The change in genetic material, chance events. We're not talking about natural selection yet. We will be talking about that soon. And they do not necessarily favor the most fit. The organism that seems the most adapted, the strongest, the best, the fastest, they're not necessarily going to be the ones that survive in genetic drift. Now think of a raft just drifting down sort of by chance, going down the stream. This is changes in the genetic makeup of a population by chance. Now I'll illustrate this with some examples for you. Chance events such as volcanoes, earthquake, disease, hunting, famine, these are all things that don't necessarily favor the most fit. If a volcano erupts, the organisms that are really adapted to survive and all that don't necessarily survive. They might by accident be wiped out. Or an earthquake, or if a disease comes along, it doesn't, pick and choose. Or if there's hunting and the organisms are just standing around, they could be killed, or if there's a famine. So let's look at some examples of how this could work. Sort of accidental evolution. All right, so two types of genetic drift I want to talk about are the founder effect and bottlenecks. A founder effect is when a small group of individuals become separated from the others and form a new population. They may eventually become a separate species. So we have a small population that becomes separated from the others. So imagine a scenario like this. We have an environment that is open, and all the organisms that are here feeding off the trees and the grass and the soil can also roam over here and feed off these weird, whatever kind of plants these are. Organisms breed together and everything is just moving along just fine. Over time, this happens. A mountain range occurs. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but imagine if there's a mountain range now and the organisms that are on this side can't get over to the other side to, eat the food over here, escape predators that are on this side, mate with these organisms. And these organisms here also can't get over to the other side. Over time, the organisms in region A start to become more adapted to their own environment. Hey, well, we've got trees to feed on, we've got grass, we've got this soil, whereas the organisms over here in region B become adapted to their environment. So what's happening is there is a smaller group of organisms on either side, small group here, small group over here. This is called the founder effect. The organisms on this side found a new population, separate from the organisms on this side that found a new population here. They've been separated from the others, and they now go on and they have to reproduce with each other. They have to deal with whatever predators are over here and whatever the environment is like and the climate and stuff like that. And of course, mutation will act here. Natural selection will act here, and all of that stuff that will all come together. So we'll bring that all together in a bit. And the same goes over here. Mutation is going to act. Natural selection is going to act. And over time, a new population or new species may arise here that is different from this species because there's different food, there's different predators, there's different climate here. And even if the mountain range came down, but enough time had elapsed on either side, species A starts to venture over to here, but by that time species B says, I'm not interested in you anymore. I've changed. I've developed. I have become a different species. And remember, species are organisms that can breed with themselves. They can't interbreed and have fertile young with another species. Now, what we have here is something called geographic isolation. The organisms on either side are isolated from each other. And this is called geographic isolation. They are also reproductively isolated, reproductive isolation, so that organisms on this side, A versus B, even if they, well, actually initially they are separated because of geography, they cannot interbreed with each other, so they are reproductively isolated, and they are forced to reproduce with their own kind on this side and with their own kind on this side. And if changes occur by mutation, all right, if some kind of change occurs, they got thicker fur, who are they going to reproduce with? Well, with more organisms that have thicker fur and more organisms that have thicker fur again and again and again. And if these ones have thinner fur, let's say it's hotter over here and they need thinner fur, all right, they're going to reproduce with organisms with thinner fur. And over time, that trait increases in frequency. And that increases in frequency on this side. These ones become thick, these ones become thin, and that is evolution. And they're isolated from each other. Because if you have thick fur here, and I'll put a little t for thin fur over here, if you can have these guys come over and mate with them, then you start getting some thin fur over here. And if these can come over and mate with them, you start getting thick over here, and you dilute it out. It's sort of neutral, all right? What you need is separation for evolution to occur so that the specific traits on either side start to build up and you get differences. Well, evolution is the idea of differences, things changing. So we have different types of isolation. We can have ecologic isolation as well. Ecologic isolation is when we have organisms, let's say organisms are living up in the tree. And they go, hey, well, there's all kinds of food and shelter that I need. And other organisms say, well, I'm going to live down here on the grass. I'm just fine down here getting my food and shelter. And they just don't interbreed with each other, even though they're relatively in close proximity, but they're separated ecologically. They live in slightly different niches or niches here from each other. And these guys may develop over time into species A, and these ones may develop into species B over time, and they just don't interbreed with each other. They're isolated in ecology. And there are many types of isolations in evolution. Temporal isolation. Over time, it may turn out that these guys say, you know what, I reproduce in the fall. And these guys go, well, you know, I'd like to go on a date with you, but I reproduce in the summer. So now, because they reproduce at different times, they are isolated temporally in time. All of these things keep organisms separate, even in the same general area. They separate them out so that whatever traits are building up in these organisms due to mutation are different from the traits building up in these ones, and they become different species. This is called speciation, and this is evolution. Okay. Let's go on. More founder effect. Imagine this scenario, okay, for founder effect. Imagine that some birds are up here. We've got 100 birds. And they say, you know what? It's getting cold here. Let's migrate. And then they start their journey, and they're flying along the coast. And they're heading down to Florida. Let's go to Miami Beach, all right? Along the way, some of the birds get blown off course by some violent weather. Let's say 25 birds get blown off course there. And another 25 birds get blown off course and land on this island. 50 of them make it for the reunion in Miami Beach. These organisms that land on a different island found a new population. So the organisms that are on different environments found a new population. These ones do as well. This is called the founder effect. These birds landing on this island cannot easily mate with these ones at Miami Beach or these ones on another island. They stay there. And imagine if the vegetation is different, the food, the predators, the climate, over time, they start to change a little bit. They become species A. Over time, these ones on a slightly different island change a little bit and they become species B. And these ones in Miami, we'll call them species C. All right, so this is the founder effect where we have a small group of organisms creating a new population in an isolated area. They are geographically and reproductively isolated. So whatever you have on that island is what you have to choose from. So imagine they're looking around for a mate. Who am I going to mate with? Well, okay, I got this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, and you have babies. Then you're looking around. Who am I going to mate with? Whatever traits appear on that island are brought in from those birds originally or are created through mutation. Those traits can't be exchanged with other organisms on the other island. So if, let's say, long beaks start to become prevalent on this island, and it works for them because there's the right flowers, I'm going to talk more about that in a bit, then you can't get this long-beaked bird to go and mate with a short-beaked bird because over time they build up on this island in a small population in an isolated area. And that's how the founder effect works. Now again, we're talking microevolution, so we're talking about small-scale changes in these organisms, not going from like a long beak to a flying dinosaur thing, okay? We're just talking about within a particular species or population. Okay, moving on. Let's skip that. Another type of genetic drift is called a bottleneck. And this is where a small group of individuals survive to reproduce following a disease or famine or some condition that only selects for that small group, and it's relatively random. So imagine if there's a population of organisms and there was a disease. It doesn't matter if you had thicker fur and you were a wolf, because now you're so adapted to the cold, that thick fur doesn't matter anymore. Or if you were a tall organism or round, now it is random who lives and who dies. It is not natural selection, survival of the fittest. It's just a random thing. Or if there's a famine, or if there was hunting. Now, let me show you an example of what I'm talking about here. Bottleneck, just like a bottle. All right. So here we have a population of organisms with all of the genes that they would have. This is called their gene pool. Whatever genes collectively they have, the gene pool. So as we can see, there's some red genes and some blue genes and some orange genes. But now some selective pressure, like a disease, occurs. And that is where the bottleneck happens, right down here. Okay? And it doesn't matter what color you are or how thick your fur is or how strong you are or how tall you are. Randomly, some organisms survive and some don't. It just so happens that this red one and this red one and this blue one did. You now get a new population formed from those organisms that existed over there. So it's a bottleneck, and these ones go on and found a new population. So it is like the founder effect, where you get a small group of individuals creating a new population, but it's really called a bottleneck caused by things like famine, disease, hunting. Like let's say some guy comes out and just happens to shoot this one and that one, that one, that one, shoots that one. What's left of the population, all right? That's called a bottleneck. And it's a type of genetic drift. It is not choosing survival of the fittest. It is not mutation. It's genetic drift where the frequency of the genes, right, in this case, 2 red to 1 blue, is different than the frequency of the genes over there. And now these guys here go on and found the population. And really, what are you going to choose from? You got 1 blue and 2 red. The odds are that 2 reds are going to reproduce, form another red, and then another red, and another red. And okay, you'll get a blue, but they're going to get another red and another red. And over time, look what you've got. A lot of red compared to what you had here. That's evolution. You don't have to grow 12 arms and 3 legs and 4 eyes and be a dinosaur to call it evolution. A change in gene frequency is evolution. So the population has evolved. Okay. Consider this, however. Due to genetic drift, the most fit organisms are not necessarily selected for. The most fit are not necessarily selected for. And that's what I just said in Bottleneck. If you got some famine or disease or hunting, it's not necessarily the most fit. And it's not the most adaptive. So I want you to imagine this, because usually when people think about evolution, they think the most fit organisms are going to be the ones to survive, right? The most adapted. And that's often how it will work. If an organism is well adapted and has the right length of beak or thickness of fur or whatever, they're going to survive. They're going to pass on those traits, and the population will evolve in that direction of having long beaks or thick fur or whatever. But imagine you have a weird scenario where you have something like this. We have these pink guys over here, and they're very well adapted. Just a beautiful shade of pink, lovely little organisms. And over here, you got these really weird green guys with all these pock marks in their face. Like, how could they ever survive? They certainly aren't going to be selected for, and no one is going to want to mate with them anyhow and have more babies that are green, right? Well, imagine an accident then occurring, all right? What if there's a volcano that just happens to erupt, and this guy dies, and this guy dies, and this guy dies? It's not that these ones were more adapted to the environment, better, fitter, stronger, faster, or even better looking so that they could find mates. They were the weird ones, the odd ones out. And yet, these ones go extinct. These ones survive as a species. Isn't that strange? It can be accidental. It's not always survival of the best or of the fittest. It can be an accident like that. So keep that in mind. Okay, now, the next concept for microevolution is gene flow. And really what we're looking at is a reduction in gene flow, where we don't have immigration or emigration of individuals. Because of that, we have no new genes entering the population or exiting the population. Because in order for evolution to occur, as I've said a number of times, you need organisms to be isolated and not be able to reproduce with other organisms outside of their general population. So let us look at a scenario here, okay? And I've already mentioned this, but on this island, we have creatures that happen to have long legs. And on this island, we happen to have creatures that happen to have short legs. And it works for them on island A, and it works for these guys on island B. If they were able to breed with each other, then over time, this long leg trait would be diluted out. You wouldn't have most of the creatures with long legs. If the short ones come in bringing their genes causing shortness, it would dilute out so that it would be balanced. And if the long leg ones went over here, the creatures with short legs could start mating with creatures with long legs, and over time they would be diluted out. What we need for evolution is isolated populations that can only breed with each other and no gene flow. And that way, these guys look around and go, who am I going to go out on a date with? Well, I guess they're going to have long legs, and our babies will have long legs. And our babies will have long legs and long legs and long legs. You guys over here go, who am I going to go out on a date with? Short legs, short legs, short legs. And what we need for evolution is a change in gene frequency. Well, if we compare the islands now, these ones are short and these ones are long, and that is evolution. But if they can mix together, then you get a sort of homogeneous mix of stuff. We need sort of extreme stuff to happen. So, microevolution occurs best, or evolution in general, where gene flow is stopped or reduced. And what's perfect for that is geographic isolation. Like I said earlier, volcanoes and continents drifting apart from each other. That geographic isolation leads to reproductive isolation and therefore no gene flow. And that's what we need. Now we need to talk about natural selection. Now, chances are you've heard of natural selection and maybe even studied it. Survival of the most fit. And when we say most fit, we don't necessarily mean the strongest, right? It may be physical traits, might be tallest, might even be shortest. Some physical traits that give organisms fitness, the beak, length or shape, the feathers, the fur. They could be behavioral traits, the way that they hunt, the way that they have the right mating behaviors, physiological traits, how the chemistry of the body works. Are the enzymes working right? Is hemoglobin working right? You know, the DNA and that kind of stuff. So fitness comes not just in physical traits, but in these other traits. Survival of the organisms with those fitness traits. The most fit organisms are selected for. Now get used to this phrasing. When someone says selected for, that means nature, not, an individual is selecting organisms to survive. So natural selection, organisms are selected for, meaning they have the best traits to survive, the adaptations to survive in that particular environment. They survive, but in order for evolution to occur, they have to reproduce, pass it on to their offspring. Those adaptive traits go on to the offspring, and those offspring have those adaptive traits and they pass them on, etc. So that's how natural selection works. Organisms with the adaptive traits are selected for, they survive, they reproduce, they pass them on. And over time, the population increases with those adaptive traits. Now, imagine a scenario like this. We have some tall individuals and some short individuals. All right. Depending on the environment, though, depending on what the situation is, if you have small little shelters like this, I think it's pretty obvious that the tall people can't get in there. Let's say they're running away from a predator, but the short people have an advantage because they can get into that shelter in that case. And so the short ones have an advantage. But in another scenario, we could have these very tall plant-like structures, and now it's going to be the tall organisms that have the advantage. They can reach, all right, whereas the short ones, they can't reach the fruit, and they would tend to die off. So depending on the environment, there are different, adaptive traits. So there is no one type of organism that is best adapted for everything. And evolution doesn't work like that organisms get better and better and better and better. It depends on the environment they're in. And just like the founder effect, if those birds heading down to Florida get blown off course, they end up on the other island, they may have been really well prepared for Miami Beach. They got their bathing suit, they got their towel, their little cap, and they're ready for Miami. But wait a second, we're on an island now. We got coconuts. We're not going to the beach, buddy. Now those organisms on the island, different traits may be more advantageous than they were at Miami Beach. I think it's just getting cold out here, and that's why I'm thinking about Miami Beach. Okay, so let's go on with selection. Let's talk about the three types of natural selection, all right? Now, you're going to see the term phenotype again, and stabilizing selection is when the average, not the extreme phenotype, is selected for. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to show you a graph in just a minute, but the average phenotypes is selected for, and the extremes are not as well adapted to the environment. They're not as fit to survive. So let's look at how we could graphically represent that. So here we have the number of organisms in a population compared to the phenotype. Now remember, the phenotype is the expression of the genotype. So a phenotype might be, well, we've got some short-beaked birds, let's say on an island. We got some short-beak, we got some average-length beaked birds and long beaks. Now, you're going to notice that the curve goes down here so that there's less individuals there, less individuals here, but the most individuals have average length beaks. So here's a short beak, really long beak, and just an average beak. So how could this work? Well, birds often tend to feed on flowers and insects. So just imagine a flower that has the right length of the flower so that a bird with an average beak length can fit into that flower, get the nectar without poking the flower, like in this case, and breaking it, or this one not even being able to reach. In this case, if these birds were in a group and they were blown onto that island, and there's 50 of them, some were like this and some were like that, some were like that, all right? They're still all the same species. They just have slightly different beak lengths, okay? And they all land on the island. Which ones are going to survive best? Well, these ones survive best, and they then live to reproduce. They have babies with average beak lengths. These ones start to die off. They can't compete very well. These ones start to die off. They can't compete very well. And so these ones proliferate, and the curve looks like this. And it's called stabilizing selection because the average phenotype is sort of stable. All right? So this is an example of natural selection where a particular trait that's not too extreme is being selected for, and the extreme versions of that trait are not advantageous and they're selected against. It's natural selection causing evolution. And when I say evolution again, remember what we're saying is there's only a couple of short beak birds left on the island over time and long beaks, whereas the average beak goes up in frequency. Lots of these compared to these. That is evolution. Okay. Let's go on to our next example. Directional selection is when one main extreme phenotype is selected for. We move in a particular direction, okay? One extreme phenotype is selected for. That one is the best adapted or most fit. So maybe you can imagine what I'm about to do. This is the same scenario we originally have, all right? But over time, this is what happens. So let's analyze this graph. We have a number of organisms versus a phenotype. And here you can see that organisms with a long beak are way up, whereas organisms with a short beak are way down. And even the average one is down. This is an extreme phenotype. This is an extreme phenotype as well. These are both extremes, long and short, and this is average. But in this case, one extreme is selected for. So imagine now you've got birds with long beaks. That's the beak of the bird, all right? Because the flowers are very long, all right? And they stick their beak down, and the nectar that they need is way down there. And average length beaks don't work. Short beaks don't work. These guys work. They increase in the population, and the population shifts. As the babies are born, all with long beaks, we get more and more. The population shifts in that particular direction. So it's called directional selection. It is still natural selection, survival of the fittest or most adapted. Well, which one is the fittest or most adapted? These guys with long beaks. They reproduce more. The other ones can't compete. You guys are all dying off. These ones increase and the population shifts. That's evolution. It's not that these guys developed armor plates and 12 legs. They just have a different beak, and that's evolution. Okay? There's one more type of this. I've got a couple more things I want to discuss with you. Disruptive selection. This is when the extreme phenotypes are selected for and the intermediate or average is selected against. It's least adaptive. So, start with the original curve, and over time, these average guys are going to be selected against. So look at what happens. The average, which was right in the middle, just can't compete. Sorry, you're not good. Short beaks do really well now. Long beaks do really well. These are the extreme phenotypes. The average is selected against. It disrupts the curve in the middle, and the ends do really well. How could that work? Well, imagine these birds are blown onto an island. There's 50 birds with all different beak lengths. They land on an island, and on that island, the birds with the short beaks, that's a bird, do really well because the flowers are, well, they're relatively short. And there's lots of flowers for the long beak ones as well. There's long flowers, all right? But there's not really very many intermediate length flowers. They just don't really exist on that particular island. These guys can't compete. They die off. These guys live, reproduce, lots of short-beaked birds, lots of long-beaked birds. Disruptive selection, survival of the fittest, but it's not always just one type, right? There's many different varieties and adaptations that can work, as long as you have the resources, shelter, and mates for that. If there are short flowers, these short-beaked birds can survive. If there aren't, then they're going to get wiped out as well. Okay, so that's disruptive. So 3 types of natural selection that can occur. So let's put it all together. I want you to imagine a scenario with me here. Let's imagine that there are 2 islands, and once upon a time there were these bluebirds living on one of the islands, and there were flowers of the correct length for their beaks, and they were living very happily and everything was fine. And then one day they traveled to another island or got blown to another island, and they decided to stay there. Maybe they couldn't get back, or maybe they go, wow, look at this place. This place is great and it's not very crowded. Let's just stay here. And genetic mutation occurred as generations reproduced, and over time they changed a little bit. And I'm illustrating a genetic change by turning them red. All right, small scale changes. This was a color change. But on that particular island, there were also a lot of very long plants, and I'm representing them by this, all right? And so more genetic mutations occur, and you happen to have some birds with long beaks, and these ones happen to be more well adapted to those. And maybe the short-beaked birds, maybe they ate all the flowers that were short, or something happened to those flowers. And now they start to die off. The long-beaked birds are surviving and they reproduce. And of course, they have founded a new population on that island, all right? So this is the founder effect. This is genetic mutation. This is natural selection, survival of the most fit. In this case, the long beaks on these guys, the short beaks on these guys, and that's how it would go. Even if they wanted to come over and visit and have a reunion, this guy coming over here, they've changed now. They go, I don't recognize you anymore. You have a long beak. And this guy goes, well, you have a short beak. And you're a different color than me. And so they have become geographically isolated, reproductively isolated. Maybe there's other types of isolation. We saw the example of the founder effect, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's how all of that stuff comes together. And so we've looked at what is microevolution, a small-scale change in gene frequencies. We're not talking about dogs becoming dinosaurs. We're talking about small changes, maybe within the dog species. We've looked at how it happens through genetic mutation, creating new types of genes so that you can go from a short beak to a long beak. That's going to require mutation in order to have that. How genetic drift could work with organisms founding a new population, or a disease or a famine wiping out a large population down to a small population, and we really need small populations in order for evolution. Small populations that are isolated from each other geographically or however, so that gene flow can't occur, and whatever traits exist within those separate populations in those separate areas, those traits are the ones that will build up and be selected for or against. In region A, you've got these number of traits, and then natural selection will act. Well, are these advantageous or not? And over time, the advantageous traits will increase in region A, and they may become different than region B. You have different species. That was speciation. Okay, natural selection was acting, and of course, there are different types of natural selection. So, I hope that helps you review your microevolution. Thank you for watching.